Hi everybody, I'm Preston Abity, and today I'm going to talk about an investigation into the viability of cell-level temperature control for lithium-ion battery packs. Now, as some of us might already know, lithium-ion batteries have become increasingly popular over the past few years. One of the reasons for that is shown in this graph here on the right, where we can see that their energy and power density is higher than that of these other energy storage options. Now, because of that, we've begun to see them implemented in things like stationary energy storage, as well as moving towards lightweight applications like electric vehicles. An issue with these packs, though, is that their operation is temperature sensitive. And so at high temperatures, what we can expect to see is advanced degradation of the cells, as well as possible safety issues, such as thermal runaway. Now, to attenuate those high temperatures, we have a variety of options, but ultimately all of these options still result in temperature gradients or uneven temperature distributions across the pack. This can hurt us in two different ways. The first of which is exampled here on the right, which is that our battery parameters vary with temperature, and then depending upon our operating ranges, sometimes drastically. And so that could mean that we have subpar operation, in addition to the long time scale, where at different temperatures, our cells can be expected to age at different rates. And what that means is we could eventually have to retire the pack sooner than expected. Now, in light of this, we want to discover what if we could individually control the cooling that every cell in our pack receives. And then in this two-cell example, we could redirect some cooling effort from this lower temperature cell and give it to this hotter cell here in order to more effectively try to cool it. So to explore this and then to ultimately see if we can extend the life of our pack through doing this, what we're going to talk about in this work is three separate things. The first will be the design of a new pack architecture that will allow us to independently control the cooling power of our cells. Second will be an analysis, which is going to let us know if this new pack architecture will allow us to remove those differences that we previously couldn't. And then finally, we'll validate this new pack for a more realistic scenario, and then just to kind of get an idea of what kind of benefits we can expect. Now, before we move into any of this, though, we need to talk about how batteries age. And a way that we can do that is by looking at the popular character Indiana Jones. Now, over time, Indiana Jones has gotten old. He's started to kind of slouch over like you tend to do. And eventually, at the end of his career, he's going to need to trade in the whip for the cane, and he's going to have to retire. Well, theoretically, he has already. I haven't seen the latest movie, but if he hasn't, he should very much consider retiring. But regardless of whether he does or doesn't, batteries can be thought to have the same kind of life cycle, where they start out their career and in the pack, and over time they age, and then eventually have to be retired. Where this shrinking here, or this slouching, as I've shown, it doesn't mean actual physical shrinkage. What it really means is our battery is losing capacity over time. And so we typically dictate this retirement age for a cell to be at 20% capacity loss from the original capacity. And so that's how we can kind of measure the age of these cells. And now what contributes to this aging and this degradation is a number of things, but two of which we're going to consider in this work that we can consider as like traps for Indiana Jones. The downside is these cells can't run away like Indiana Jones can, so they just have to let the trap hit them. Now, the first trap, if you will, is the calendar life of the cell, so just the natural getting old over time. And then the second is the cycling the battery at high temperatures, or using it when it's too hot. Both of these terms combine then to give us the proportion of capacity lost for this cell over time. But of course, in a battery, the capacity isn't the only parameter that will age. And so to capture some more of the aging process, we're also going to represent resistance growth as proportional to this Q loss here. And by just glancing at these equations that we have modeling our degradation, we can see that all of them depend on temperature in one way or another. And so clearly then, if we have different temperatures, these numbers will vary. And so what are we proposing to get all of these values as close together as we can for all of the cells in our pack? Well, if we start by looking at a baseline method for managing temperature, we can take a look at this example fluid cooling system, where we have a working fluid, typically some coolant, coming in through a pump, and at the pump outlet, a cooling actuator in the form of a PCM or a VCS, for example, will remove heat from that fluid, and then the fluid is evenly distributed to all of the cells in our pack, where here we just have a string of cells in series. Now, here we can point out that we only have one control input, which is that we can overall just choose to increase the cooling effort for all of the cells in our pack. Now instead, what if we had multiple cooling actuators then, and we put one at the inlet of each of these cell coolant channels, where now we can independently change the cooling that each cell receives. Now this setup, of course, can vary depending upon your original pack architecture, but for this specific setup, the way that our cells are going to interact with our coolant, if we were to take a side view of one of these channels, will look something like this, where we have three temperatures that we're looking at. The first is that of the battery, of course. The second will be the coolant that is exchanging heat with our battery. And then finally, we have the coolant exchanging heat with our cooling actuator. And that's going to give us these dynamic equations that we see down here. Now, at the end of the day, like I said, we're worried about the life of these packs, and because we know that the aging of our cells is dependent on temperature, we can see what temperature differences we can expect from each of our systems. And so to start out with just a basic case to get an idea of what's going on, we'll start with two cells here. And for our baseline system, what we find for our steady state temperature difference is that it depends on a difference in resistances between our cells. Now, in an ideal world, the difference in these resistances would be zero and our cells would be identical. However, even in a brand new battery pack, we can't expect uniformity, and commonly all of the parameters in our cells will be different, which means that this temperature difference here is all but guaranteed. Now instead, if we were able to change the cooling between our cells, what we find is that our temperature difference now still depends upon a difference in resistances, but it also then depends upon a difference in our cooling power here, where we can see that we now have some influence over this piece which we previously had no control over or no influence over. And what this tells us is that theoretically we should be able to mitigate or even possibly remove this difference here. Now, I wouldn't want you to take my word for it, of course. That would make me a bad researcher. And so I'm going to simulate this pack forward now to kind of see what we can get in terms of aging. And so what we'll do is we'll take that two-cell case. We'll give our pack some power to cool our cells, and then we'll give our cells a resistance distribution here about our nominal, where in this analysis we're going to consider that resistance growth is negligible, just to simplify this analysis some. Now what we can find in this baseline case to start out is that what we assumed earlier, or what we saw in our equations, is proven correct here, because our cells have different resistances and therefore different temperatures. We can see them aging at different rates, where cell 2 reaches its end of life mark much sooner than cell 1. However, in a battery pack, the least healthy cell is what always determines the retirement for the pack. And so in this case, though cell 1 has some more work life left in it, the pack is retired still at 1,205 days. Now instead, if we were able to then redirect some cooling effort, what we find is that our cells can age homogeneously because that temperature difference was removed. And so through that, our pack life now is extended up to 1,384 days. And that comes out then to a total increase of about 15%. And so clearly there's a benefit to being able to manipulate the power between these cells. But this is still a simple case. And so to validate this a little bit further, we'll take a look then at a larger system. Now, for a larger battery pack, we don't want to have to manually determine how much power each cell is receiving. And so what we'll do is we'll design a controller to determine what we're calling differential power, described by this equation here, as the difference from the power that a cell is receiving and the average pack power, or the power it would receive in the baseline case. It'll do that by using this feedback law here, based off of the difference in temperatures from the average. And instead of trying to guess and check our way to a good balancing gain, we'll design it instead to be based off of our hottest temperature cell. That way we can choose the max differential power we're comfortable with, so that way we aren't removing cooling completely from any of our cells. And we can use our steady state temperature solution to get the following update law here for our battery pack. So now we can use this controller for a new larger example pack, where in this case we'll consider 24 cells. We'll also give our pack some power to cool all of those cells, and we'll give the cells the same resistance distribution as before, though now resistance growth is non-negligible. So our resistance will be growing. This was just our initial distribution. And what we find is, for our temperature firstly, our proposed system is able to maintain a lower pack temperature by 1.2 degrees Celsius. And in turn, what that gives us then is a life extension for the pack of 6.3%. And so there does appear to be a benefit, even in this realistic scenario, for being able to reallocate power for cooling between our cells. Now, the 6.3% isn't 15%, of course, and it's important to note that these numbers will change, as well as the benefit will change, depending on our pack conditions. To get an idea of how that works, we'll take a look at if we were to vary this nominal power here, where starting out, when we have no cooling power, there's no benefit for either system because we aren't making any cooling effort to begin with. As we continue, though, and increase our input electric power, we end up at the case that we just saw, at 5 watts per cell nominally, or 120 watts total. And as we move past this, what we see is that our benefit continues to increase, here a little more sharply because our proposed system is getting more power and more flexibility to cool our hotter cells and further increase our temperature homogeneity. In this specifically, we end up with a max increase of a 16% life extension. And so what we find is that even in this variable condition, we do still see benefits to using this proposed system, this new architecture. And overall, by designing that architecture that let us independently manipulate cell cooling, we saw the analysis that showed us that by doing so, we can influence and remove differences that we previously couldn't. And then finally, in a little bit more of a realistic case, we saw that in variable benefits, what kind of benefits we can expect from this proposed system. Now, if any of you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or my corresponding author. But otherwise, thank you all for listening.